Today we are looking at a case from the mid-19th century, so sit back as we go to New Zealand. It's the height of the gold rush in the South Island of New Zealand. Those looking to strike it rich were flocking to the goldfields in their hundreds, but gold didn't just appeal to those seeking to find it themselves. It also drew untoward types who looked to steal it from others. Given New Zealand's proximity to Australia, used by the British for many years as a penal colony, it did not take much for those wanting to land a big score to find their way across the Tasman Sea. Richard Burgess was born Richard Hill. He grew up in England and was first arrested for theft at age 16. The prisons in England were already full, and conditions were so bad that many prisoners died of diseases such as cholera and typhoid. So those who were convicted of a transportable offence, mostly petty crimes like theft, were sent to Australia to serve out their sentences. And so it was. Richard came to Australia in 1847. He served his sentence, and upon release, he went back to his thieving ways, which resulted in a number of short prison terms. By now, Richard had developed a reputation in the Melbourne area, so in 1861, he began calling himself Richard Burgess. It was not long after that he came to hear about the gold rush in New Zealand, and naturally, he set sail for the bountiful shores, arriving in January 1862. Like Richard Burgess, Thomas Kelly was born and raised in England. In his youth, he'd been imprisoned many times, mainly for petty crimes such as theft, but after a more serious conviction for burglary, he too was transported to Australia to serve out his sentence. It was here in prison that Thomas Kelly met Richard Burgess. When he completed his sentence, and having heard of the gold rush, he too set off for New Zealand. He arrived around the same time as Richard, and the two soon reunited. Together, they conspired that, rather than establish themselves as gold prospectors, they would take the easy route, the one that they were more familiar with. They became known as violent thieves, ambushing prospectors who were on their way to cash in the gold that they had found. But Richard and Thomas weren't too smart about getting away with their crimes, and sure enough, less than a year after arriving in New Zealand, they were once again arrested, this time for their roles in a robbery in the Otago goldfields. Much to their dislike, they were sentenced to 3.5 years of hard labour. Not long after they were imprisoned, Richard Burgess attempted to escape, along with another inmate he had befriended named Henry Garrett. Henry Garrett's story mirrored that of Richard Burgess and Thomas Kelly. Growing up in England, he took to a life of crime early on. He was transported, first to a penal colony on Norfolk Island, and when that was closed, he was returned to England. But far from slowing down, his crime soon escalated, and it wasn't long before he found himself again convicted and deported, this time to the Australian mainland. After his release, he too heard the call of the goldfields, and eventually found his way to New Zealand. It didn't take long for him to establish the Garrett Gang, who became known as notorious highway robbers. In fact, it was a Garrett Gang that led the police to announce that prospectors should never travel without a small pistol on their person, just in case they ever came across a highway ambush. Whilst in prison, Henry Garrett provided detailed information to Richard Burgess and Thomas Kelly about how to make the most of the opportunity to rob travellers laden with gold. Burgess and Kelly then spent the remainder of their sentences plotting and scheming how to bring these plans to reality when they were free. They were both released in September 1865, and they assured the police that they were changed men and would become legitimate gold miners. They staked a claim near Hokitika on the west coast of the South Island. From the outside, it all looked legitimate. Burgess had a girlfriend who quickly became pregnant with his child, and the men appeared to be settled. But their schemes, inspired by Henry Garrett and his gang, were about to become actions. Thomas Kelly started to go by the alias Thomas Noon, and another criminal was about to join the duo. His name was William Levy, and he had become known to the men through their attempts at prospecting gold. William had spent time in Australia around the same time as Burgess and Kelly. Though he claimed to be a legitimate businessman, he told people that he was a gold buyer, but he mainly used his position to inform criminals of possible targets for robbery and to move on stolen goods. He too had followed the gold rush to New Zealand and upon meeting Burgess and Kelly, was soon helping them identify targets for their robberies. In April 1866, the final member of the soon-to-be Burgess gang joined the men. His name was Joseph Sullivan, and he was another criminal that had been deported from England to Australia for robbery. Upon his release from prison, he had taken to more genuine endeavours, but his commitment to a crime-free lifestyle was soon corrupted by the promise of riches beyond measure when his path crossed with Richard Burgess, Thomas Kelly and William Levy. And so these four men, who had all been convicts sent from England to Australia, became known as the Burgess Gang. Just 1 month after meeting Joseph Sullivan, the gang embarked on their greedy pursuits. In preparation for their grand plan, the men first needed weapons. Burgess decided to steal some revolvers from a police camp not far from where he was living with his girlfriend. After successfully stealing the weapons, he established a rather devious plan to make it look like he had found them by burying them on the beach. He made sure a couple of locals were walking past when he supposedly came across the revolvers buried in the sand. He thought that by doing this, if the police ever searched his house, he would be able to say that he had witnesses to corroborate his story of how he came to be in possession of them. Of course, the police did visit Richard Burgess, but after he was arrested, they were forced to release him. They did so, but with the warning, leave town, or it won't be the last time we come knocking. So Burgess, Kelly and Sullivan headed up the coast to Greymouth, while William Levy travelled by boat. By now the four men had a reputation, and as they travelled together, they courted more attention than they wanted. Their plan was to meet up in Greymouth and rob a gold buyer named Mr. Edward Fox. However, when they realised that a police inspector who knew them was now stationed in Greymouth, they decided to cross the Grey River into Cobden. On the 28th of May, they attacked and murdered a gentleman named Mr. George Dobson. He was a surveyor who they had somehow mistaken for Edward Fox. Eventually, they gave up in their pursuit of Mr. Fox and continued north to Westport, where they planned to rob the bank in town. But to their great disappointment, when they arrived, they found that the bank had been closed down. Gold had not been found in the area for quite some time, so there was no longer a need for it. Disheartened but determined, the four men adjusted their plans and travelled to Nelson by boat. Nelson sits at the top of the South Island, not far from the main shipping harbour of Picton, which was a connecting route between the North and the South Islands. The location made Nelson a popular hub for gold prospectors, who were returning from the fields laden with gold, needing a place to deposit their riches. The gang saw this as a great opportunity and set about making plans to rob a number of banks in town. The journey was quite long, and it took them more than a week to arrive in Nelson, by which time they were virtually penniless, having spent the last of their money on the boat to get there. It was now the 6th of June, and the men started to survey the banks in order to set their robberies in motion. But the police presence in the area was far too great, and they soon came to realise that it was too big a risk to take. Better to move on and find an easier target. They set off on their way to Picton, a journey of 70 miles, which would take them past the Wakamarina goldfield. After agreeing with the landowner, they slept in a disused store along the way. William Levy, with his history of finding wealthy marks, set about seeking out a new target for the gang. On the 12th of June, he visited Deep Creek, which is located near the Wakamarina goldfield. Through his various means, he came to learn about a group of prospectors who would soon be travelling to Westport, carrying money and gold. He then told the others that this newfound information and plans were made to ambush for travellers in a rural section of a trail known as the Maungatapu track. In the early hours of the 12th of June, the gang set off, planning to take up a spot near the trail where they would be able to see the travellers approaching. Along the way, they came across another traveller named James Battle, who was travelling alone. Concerned about a potential witness, they made the decision to kill him. They attacked and strangled the defenceless gentleman before burying him in a shallow grave. They then stole the £3 he was carrying and continued on their way. They camped overnight and the following morning took up their positions alongside the Maungatapu track as they waited for their victims to arrive. At 1 p.m. on the 12th of June, the four men came into view. Their names were Felix Matthew, James Dudley, John Kempthorne, and James Pontius. One by one they were attacked by the gang and killed in the cruelest fashion. One was strangled, 2 were shot, and the other was both shot and stabbed. The horses carrying their wares were also killed. 3 of the men were left in a pile together, while James de Pontius was taken a short distance away and buried separately, so when the crime was investigated, it would appear as if he had committed the murders and ran off with the takings. The Burgess gang found that the men and horses had been carrying cash and gold worth £320. They then returned to Nelson and set about selling off their proceeds. They stayed in different hotels under fake names and made a plan to travel to New Plymouth by ship. However, unbeknown to the gang, a gentleman named Henry Moller, who was a friend of one of the murdered travellers, had arranged with the group to meet them in Nelson, where he would collect the horses. He had been travelling a couple of days behind them, so when they failed to arrive as planned, he immediately informed the police that they were all missing. Henry then journeyed to where he had last seen them, back in Deep Creek. He came across a man who told him that he had let a group of men stay in his disused hut overnight. The man, named George Jarvis, remembered the group well due to their suspicious behaviour. In particular, he recalled William Levy, who, unbeknown to Mr. George Jarvis, had spoken with many people in the small town as he set about finding a target for the gang to rob. Henry Moller then told the police sergeant in Deep Creek of his fears that his friends had been murdered. The police sergeant rode with George to Nelson to organise a search party. All they found, however, were the slaughtered horses. William Levy was identified back in Nelson and taken into custody. Soon after, his companions Richard Burgess, Joseph Sullivan and Thomas Kelly were also arrested. However, the police had failed to find the bodies of the missing men, so any evidence they had against the gang was only circumstantial. The police, however, were about to employ a few new tricks of their own. They hung a poster in front of the cells of the 4 men, declaring a £200 reward and a Queen's pardon for information about the crime. They separated the men, so they were unable to discuss it with each other. Soon enough, the plan paid off when Joseph Sullivan decided to talk. He claimed he was just the lookout for the crimes, and the others were the ruthless murderers. Deciding not only to describe the murders of the 4 travellers, he then led the police directly to where the bodies lay. He even went as far as to inform the sergeant of the many other crimes that the gang had committed in the previous months, all the while minimising his role in all of them. News of the murders had gripped the public, giving New Zealand's previous innocence of such brutal crimes. The pressure was on the police, who were very eager to bring charges against the gang. Sullivan pointed the finger at Burgess as a ringleader and instigator of the various offences. All the while, the other men hadn't spoken with each other and didn't know of Sullivan's betrayal, but it soon became known that he had been talking to the police when Richard Burgess, William Levy and Thomas Kelly were charged with the murders of the gold prospectors, as well as the murder of Mr. James Battle. Sullivan's identity was officially revealed as a police informant during deposition proceedings in August 1866. Richard Burgess wrote a letter confessing to all the crimes for which he had been charged, and more. However, in a strange twist, he implicated Joseph Sullivan and tried to exonerate both Thomas Kelly and William Levy in all of the crimes. The jury, however, would have none of it. They found all 3 men guilty of multiple murders, and the judge sentenced them to death by hanging. Due to Sullivan's role as an informant, he was given amnesty for his part in the murders of the gold prospectors, but it only applied for that case, not for the murder of James Battle, which prosecutors had decided was to be tried as a separate case. In September of the same year, Sullivan was found guilty of the murder of James Battle and also sentenced to death by hanging. Sullivan claimed he should be pardoned due to his agreement in the earlier case. To the abhorrence of the public, police supported his claim. They were worried that future informants wouldn't come forward if they doubted that their agreements could protect them from the death penalty. Sullivan's sentence was converted from the death penalty to life imprisonment. On the 5th of October 1866, Richard Burgess, William Levy and Thomas Kelly were taken to the Nelson jail. The gallows had been specially constructed for the hangings, given Nelson had never had a murder case before. Usually the public were allowed to view such occasions, but given the anger towards the men and their actions, it was decided that the hanging was to be private, although a number of people still gathered around the jail in the hope of seeing the sentence being carried out. The men were walked from the jail to the gallows. Thomas Kelly was in such distress that he had to be carried onto the platform. They were given the chance to say their final words. Richard Burgess declared that he had no more fear of death than he had of going to a wedding, while William Levy calmly declared his innocence. Thomas Kelly, eventually able to speak, set about reading a rambling speech. He was mid-sentence when the hangman pulled the bolt, which opened the trapdoor at 8:30 a.m. After they were declared dead, doctors dissected their bodies. In what was common practice at the time, moulds of their heads were taken, known as a death mask. It was believed that the essence of a character of a man could be determined by looking at the shape of the features of the head in a practice called phonology. The three men, Richard Burgess, William Levy, and Thomas Kelly, were then buried in unmarked graves in the prison yard in Nelson. But what became of the informer, Joseph Sullivan? 2 years after the executions of his previous companions, he was transferred to the prison in Dunedin, where he continued to protest that he should be pardoned due to his amnesty agreement. It took 6 years, until in 1874, the governor, Sir James Ferguson, pardoned him on one condition, that he leave New Zealand immediately and never return, a condition which encompassed not being able to go to Australia either. He was sent via ship back to England, but within 6 months, he was on his way back to Australia, where he had first been sent as a convict. His freedom was short-lived, and he was soon arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Upon his release, the government of the time tried to have him deported to New Zealand, which was of course declined, given the earlier terms of his release. Reports vary on what came of Joseph Sullivan. Some state that he did indeed return to New Zealand under another name, while others claim he died in Australia. Even to this day, the memorial stands on the Maungatapu track at the site where the travelling men were murdered. This area has become known as Murderers Rock. The death masks of the three hanged men are still on display at the Nelson Provincial Museum. In 2020, a short film called Death Around Every Bend was produced, gruesomely detailing the story of the 1866 Maungatapu Murders. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.